At 63, I used this simple ritual and eliminated impotence. What doctors don't want you to know, I am 63 years old. And at my last checkup, my doctor looked at my blood work and said something I was not expecting. He said the circulation markers in my panel were better than they had been 10 years ago. He turned the screen toward me and pointed at the numbers, as if I might not believe him. He said, "Whatever you changed, it's showing up." He didn't ask what I changed. I think he assumed it was something he had prescribed. It wasn't. It was something I had found on my own, after years of looking in the wrong direction, and after a long time of not looking at all, because I had convinced myself the door was already closed. I want to tell you about the ritual I put in place. A simple one, nothing dramatic, nothing that required a prescription or a specialist or a conversation I wasn't ready to have, that turned those numbers around and gave me back something I had accepted as permanently gone. Not just in a clinical sense, in the most basic private sense of what it means to be a man who still feels like himself, a man whose body still responds, a man whose wife still looks at him the way she looked at him 30 years ago and finds what she's looking for. I am not a doctor. I have no credentials. What I have is 63 years lived in this body, and a few specific years in which I learned more about it than any appointment ever taught me. That's the only authority I'm claiming. If any part of what I just said means something to you, if there's a version of yourself from 10 or 15 years ago that you've stopped believing you'd find again, stay until the end. The part that changed everything comes later. I'll show you exactly where I found it. But first I need to tell you where I'd been. I know the feeling I'm describing. I know the silence around it. I know how long a man can carry it without saying a word to anyone. I went through it. For longer than I admitted to anyone, including myself. Stay. Let me start at the beginning. I will tell you the moment I admitted to myself that something had gone wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday evening. Nothing special about it. Dinner had been ordinary. We'd watched something. And my wife had come to find me in the other room and stood in the doorway in a way that used to mean one thing without needing words. I looked at her. She looked at me. And I said quietly that I was tired. She nodded. She didn't push. She never pushed. That was the moment. Not because of what happened, but because of how automatic it was. How quickly I reached for the excuse, how easily it came, and how little I had to feel in order to say it. Something had gone from urgency to habit to absence so gradually that I had stopped noticing the absence. That Tuesday, I noticed. The months before had been a slow accumulation of what I now understand as a kind of quiet withdrawal. Not from my wife specifically, from the part of my life that had always made me feel present. I stopped initiating. I found reasons to be in other rooms at the times that used to come naturally. I slept on my side, facing away, without ever saying why. My wife knew. She had to know. But we had been together long enough that silence between us was rarely hostile. It was more like two people adjusting to a new room without admitting the old one had disappeared. I went to the doctor 3 months after that Tuesday. I told him, as plainly as I could, what had been happening. He listened in the way doctors listen when they have heard something many times before, with a careful patience that doesn't quite reach the eyes. He ran tests. He checked my testosterone. And then he sat back and said the numbers were within normal range for a man my age, that this was a common part of aging, and that if it was significantly bothering me, there were medications available. I asked him what caused it, not whether there was a pill. What caused it? He said, age, stress, possible vascular changes. As if the cause was interesting only as something to verify, not as something to address. I walked out of that office with a piece of paper I never filled, and with something heavier than what I had walked in with. Not crushed hope, because I hadn't gone in with much hope. Something more like confirmation. The path through this wasn't going to come from that direction. I didn't talk to anyone about it for months. I went through the days with the practiced composure of a man who had learned, over decades of teaching other people's children, to appear calm regardless of what was happening underneath. Surface calm had become a reflex. Underneath it was something else. A low, persistent awareness that I was smaller than I had been. Not in the world's eyes, in my own. The conversation that changed things happened at my wife's family gathering, in the garden of her sister's house. Late afternoon. Most people had moved inside. I was still sitting at the table with her brother-in-law, a man I had known for years without ever being particularly close to. He was a few years older than me, 67 perhaps, and he had, I noticed, a quality of ease about him that I recognized from before, from a version of myself I had stopped thinking about. He poured himself something and said without preamble that he had almost ended his marriage at 64. I looked at him. He said he didn't mean there had been a fight or another person. He meant he had become a ghost in his own house. His wife had described it to him one evening, quietly, with no accusation in her voice, which was worse than if there had been. She said she felt like she was living with someone who was waiting to die. I didn't say anything for a moment. He said the thing that surprised him most was how physical the root of it was. He had assumed what was happening to him was in his head. Emotional, psychological, a matter of attitude. It turned out to have very little to do with attitude. It had to do with blood, with the small vessels in the body that carry what makes a man feel like a man, and with what happens when those vessels stop functioning properly because years of inflammation and inactivity have slowly narrowed them. He said he had been resistant for a long time. He was blunt about that. His resistance had nothing to do with distrust of medicine or supplements. It was simpler and more embarrassing. He didn't want to need anything. He had built his identity on the idea that whatever was wrong with him was his to fix with his own hands. Asking for help from a product felt like an admission he couldn't make. I recognized that immediately. He told me what broke the stubbornness was the word his wife used. Ghost. He sat with that word for a week. Then he decided his pride wasn't worth the cost. He told me what he'd found. He said it wasn't complicated. A combination of natural things. And he mentioned two specifically. One was an antioxidant that works on the small peripheral blood vessels, the ones that matter most for circulation in the tissue that responds when a man's body functions the way it should. He said it addressed a kind of slow oxidative damage in those vessel walls. Damage that accumulates silently, never causes a specific pain, just a gradual narrowing and a gradual loss of response. The second was saw palmetto, which he'd initially thought of only as something for the prostate. He came to understand it differently. Past 50, the body tends to convert testosterone into a quieter form that doesn't do what testosterone does, and saw palmetto interrupts that conversion. It protects what's already there from being wasted. He told me the link was simple to find. He offered to send it to me. He didn't push. I told him I'd think about it. I sat with the conversation for 2 weeks before doing anything. My stubbornness was a companion of long standing, and it didn't leave easily. But I kept returning to the word ghost, and to my wife in that doorway, and to how many times since that Tuesday I had seen some version of her quiet nod. I sent him a message. He sent me the link. I read through it that night, alone in the kitchen, the house still. I ordered it the following day. I want to be honest about what followed. I didn't expect it to work. I took it consistently, methodically, without watching too closely, the way a teacher sets an exercise and waits. Somewhere around the 5th week, I woke on a Saturday morning with a physical awareness I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not urgency. Presence. The kind that doesn't need a reason. That is simply there when the system is functioning the way it was designed to. I lay still for a few minutes, the way you pause when a noise that had been in the background for months has gone quiet and the room is suddenly still. My wife noticed before I said anything. A few weeks later, offhand, in a way she wouldn't have named as a test, but clearly had been paying attention. She said something small that I won't repeat here, but I knew what it meant. The link is in the description if you want to look at it at your own pace. No pressure. But that was only part of what changed. Let me tell you what else I found. The first thing I changed in my daily habits was how I treated the first hour of the morning. I had been a teacher for over 25 years, and teachers learn to move fast from the moment the alarm sounds. When I retired, I kept the same pattern out of habit. Wake, phone, coffee, start the internal noise as early as possible. I didn't realize how much that early noise was affecting the rest of the day until I changed it. The body's cortisol cycle peaks in the morning. That's the chemical that wakes you, gives you momentum. The problem is what you do with that peak. If you immediately pour stimulation onto it, notifications, news, the low-grade anxiety of screens before you've had 5 minutes to simply be awake, you extend the cortisol window past the point it was designed to be active. And here is the mechanism worth understanding. Cortisol and testosterone share precursor material in the body. When the body keeps producing cortisol because the nervous system keeps signaling urgency, it does so partly at the expense of the raw material it would otherwise use for testosterone. A European endocrinology study found that men with consistently elevated morning cortisol had measurably lower free testosterone across the following day, even when total testosterone appeared normal. Free testosterone, the form the body can actually use, was the variable. And the first hour of the morning is where much of the day's hormonal balance is determined. What I changed was simple. No phone for the first 30 minutes after waking. Coffee, a chair, sometimes the garden. The only requirement is the absence of urgency. The common mistake is treating this as something that requires technique or intention. It doesn't. It requires only that nothing demands a reaction. 30 minutes. Every day. Non-negotiable. The way a class schedule was non-negotiable for 25 years. The second thing I changed was what I ate in the first half of the day. For most of my working life, I ate whatever was fast. Skipped mornings, heavy evenings, precisely backwards from what the body prefers. The body's hormonal systems run better when the larger nutritional load comes earlier. What I settled on was this: breakfast with protein and fat before 10. Eggs cooked in olive oil or butter, something green if available. No sweetened drinks before noon. A nutrition metabolism study following men between 55 and 70 found that those who consumed at least 20 grams of protein before 10 in the morning had significantly more stable testosterone levels across the following 8 hours, compared to men who skipped or ate primarily carbohydrates early. The mechanism is insulin. Large carbohydrate loads spike insulin, which suppresses the hormonal signaling that governs testosterone production. The common mistake is assuming any breakfast counts. A sweetened drink and bread are, from a hormonal standpoint, worse than nothing. The instruction is simple: protein and fat in the morning, before 10, every day. The third thing I changed was walking, not performance exercise, walking. What I hadn't understood was the specific relationship between consistent low-intensity movement and the small peripheral vessels, the same vessels the conversation in the garden had been about. There is something in the sustained, rhythmic nature of a long walk that stimulates what researchers call vascular remodeling, the slow process by which small vessel walls retain their elasticity and their ability to dilate on demand. A study from the European Heart Journal found that men over 50 who walked at a moderate pace for at least 30 minutes most days had significantly better peripheral vascular function than sedentary controls, and that the effect was measurable even in men who began the habit after years of inactivity. The window of response was not closed. It was slower to open, but it opened. I walk every morning after breakfast, 30 to 40 minutes, no particular route, no phone. The mistake men make is going too hard too fast, deciding to get fit, starting to run, injuring something, stopping. The vascular benefit comes from consistency over months, not intensity over days. 30 minutes, 5 or 6 days a week. That is the real prescription. The fourth thing I changed was the last thing I ate each evening. I had always ended the day with something sweet. Crackers, a piece of something from the cabinet. I didn't think of it as significant. The body's nighttime testosterone production happens during the deep sleep cycles in the first half of the night. What disrupts those cycles most reliably is blood sugar instability. When you eat sugar or refined carbohydrates late, the resulting spike and drop can pull you out of deep sleep without fully waking you. You wake feeling like you slept, but you didn't sleep in the way that matters. A sleep and metabolism research summary described it plainly. Nighttime blood sugar stability is a prerequisite for hormonal restoration during sleep. Not a contributing factor, a prerequisite. Nothing sweet, nothing refined, after 8 in the evening. If hunger is real, a small amount of protein, a few unsalted nuts, is tolerable. But the sweet habit at the end of the day costs men far more than they realize. That one cost me more than the others to give up. I've held it. I am 63 years old. I live in a house with a garden, in a quiet place, with a woman I have been married to for 31 years. She is the reason I eventually stopped being stubborn enough to miss the window entirely. She is also the reason I'm still talking about this, because I know there are men watching this who have the same stubbornness I had, the same conviction that needing something makes you less of what you were supposed to be. It doesn't. It makes you someone who chose to be present for the life that was still in front of him. I want to be direct with you about something before we close. The body does not hold the door open indefinitely. The small vessels that determine so much of what we've been talking about, they respond to intervention. But they respond better the earlier that intervention comes. Not because past a certain age nothing works. Because the tissue is more responsive before it has spent more years in the state it's been in. There is a window. I was close to missing mine. I caught it. Not everyone does. And I'm not saying that to frighten you. I'm saying it because it's the most useful thing I know, and because I wish someone had said it to me earlier. I know what the cost of staying the same actually looks like. Not in dramatic terms. No catastrophe. No single breaking point. Just more Tuesday evenings reaching for the excuse before she finishes the thought. More mornings turning toward the wall because you don't know what to say with your body. More of the quiet, practiced composure that looks fine from the outside and costs more than anyone who hasn't been there can understand. More years of feeling like the shape of a man without the substance of one. That quiet, invisible cost compounds. The same way interest accumulates on something you didn't choose to borrow. The habits I shared in this video and what I found in the description belong together. Neither one replaces the other. They are part of the same path. Leave in the comments your age, and one thing you still do that you don't think most men your age are still doing. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Go there. Read through it at your own pace. Make your own decision. No countdown, no pressure, no version of this that requires you to decide right now. The men who found their way back had one thing in common. Not a specific supplement, not a particular habit. They stopped letting stubbornness stand between them and the version of their life that was still possible. That's the only distance left to close. I spent too long thinking the door was closed. It wasn't. It was just heavy. And the men who went through it weren't stronger than me. They were just willing to push a little sooner than I was.